Hey everybody, this is Aubrey Chavez from Faith Matters. We couldn't be more excited about the conversation that we get to share with you today. It's a conversation that Tim and I have hoped to have since we began this work with Faith Matters. Or maybe more accurately, it's a conversation we'd hoped to have 15 years ago since this new phase of our faith journey really began. Today's guest is Richard Bushman, who is simply one of the most important scholarly voices ever in the Latter-day Saint tradition. Of course, Richard has been interviewed many times over the years, and we wanted to make sure that we covered new ground while asking for his perspective on some of the questions that have propelled and perplexed us throughout our faith journey. So in this very wide-ranging conversation, Richard spoke about his early journey from agnosticism to faith, why learning history and learning from history are so important, the revelatory process, including his own experience through giving patriarchal blessings, and the legacy of rough stone rolling, and even why he wants to live in a world where there could be such a thing as gold plates. Richard received his AM, AB, and PhD in the history of American civilization from Harvard University, and through the years he has taught at Harvard, BYU, Boston University, and the University of Delaware and Columbia. He married his wife Claudia Lauper Bushman in August 1955, and together they have 4 sons and 2 daughters. He's written many books, including, of course, Joseph Smith, Rough Stone Rolling, which has been called the crowning achievement of the new Mormon history. Richard served a mission to New England and Atlantic Canada, and his callings over the years have included seminary teacher, bishop, stake president, and stake patriarch. Richard is also the co-founder and chairman of Center for Latter-day Saint Arts, which is a project that is incredibly important to him. You'll hear him discuss it in the episode and why he believes that art is really the next frontier for the church, and why he's so excited about what's to come. The center will be having a large festival in 2024, so to stay up to date with that project or to donate, you can head to centerforlatterdaysaintarts.org. Again, we couldn't be more excited about this episode, and we're so incredibly grateful to Richard for taking the time to speak with us. And with that, we'll jump right in.
Well, Richard Bushman, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. It's truly an honor to have you here.
Delighted to be here.
We do consider you and Claudia some of our real heroes, and I've personally been looking forward to this, and I know Aubrey really has as well. I thought maybe that one place to start. We've read that you have stated that in your sort of early years you leaned more toward agnosticism. I wonder if you wouldn't mind walking us through a little bit of your early journey of faith.
Mm-hmm. Well, lots of us these days, Latter-day Saints, have problems somewhere along the line. Mine took a slightly different form. Most people worry about Joseph Smith or the Book of Mormon. My worry was about God, because I was a Harvard undergraduate at a moment I arrived there in 1949 when logical positivism was at its heyday. This is the belief that the only thing that is real are the things you can sense through your 5 senses and then deduce logical deductions from them, which was meant to eliminate God, angels, all the supernatural things. And the great problem with belief in God, there was no sensual evidence. It was nonsense. And I got hit by some papers I wrote on Nietzsche and Freud, and altogether, by the middle of my sophomore year, I wasn't sure I could believe there was a God. I didn't disbelieve, but I didn't believe. And of course, I, meanwhile, at Christmas time, had been interviewed for a mission and lost my faith. And in spring, I was supposed to go on a mission. And I told the stake president, I don't really believe in God. He said, "Oh, that's all right." And when I talked to the mission president when I got there, I said, "Do you have a testimony?" I said, "No, I don't have a testimony." But somehow, I can't now reconstruct how it happened. I stumbled through those early months of my mission and asking all the hard questions. And by the time I was in Halifax, Nova Scotia, by the time he came up for the first zone conference, I had a testimony. I just said, "I know the Book of Mormon is true." I didn't have any great experiences. It wasn't like a night of prayer and then the vision came. It just gradually worked its way through my mind that the Book of Mormon was true. So it doesn't mean that I ended asking questions. I still ask questions about everything. But I've just lived a full Latter-day Saint life since that time, done all the things you do, and lived all the standards, and been very happy with it, actually. So it was sort of a faith journey with a few bumps at the beginning, and then everything was fine.
I'd love to hear more about that and sort of how you were thinking about true, because it sounds like if the questions were sort of remaining, was it your mission to figure out if you could prove that the church was still, or God was still logically there, or was it more of a, you were judging by fruits and moving forward, or, how did you, it just feels like in such an academic setting, it would be so, especially when you return home from your mission, I feel like you'd probably have to define that for yourself. Like, what do you even mean by what's true?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. What I decided fairly soon, you can't settle the question of God by scientific methods. It's just not designed for that. And I don't really think you can decide about the Book of Mormon by scientific methods. You can make evidence cases on both sides. But what I began to see that there were more important questions that troubled me than is there a God. And the question for me was, how do you live a good life? Wow. I felt very strongly the need to be a better person, partly for my wife and my kids, but for my students and for my own self-satisfaction. I was a little unhappy with myself a fair amount of the time. And I simply found that if I did what I was taught to do, the simple things, especially praying, but sometimes fasting, sometimes studying, that I could be the kind of person I wanted to be. And that seemed to me a kind of truth. And you couldn't fake it. You couldn't say, I'll pretend there's a God, and so I can get the benefits. I really had to believe there was a God. It was as important a truth to me as anything I knew. And I felt like on those grounds, I just had to grasp and embrace and make that the center of my life.
So would you say, this is so interesting to me because I've been in that position of feeling like I would like to believe, but I feel nothing. And it's like, it's such a scary feeling to want to, and to hope that there's God, but to be really afraid that the fact is that there's nothing. And so it almost sounds like what you're saying though, is that that what you did get to choose was how to live. It was like, it almost sounds to me like you're saying you worked backwards. Because I felt like I had to build belief first and then I would know how to act. And I love the idea that maybe you could do that the other way around, that you could act the ways that you would act if you knew. And then does that sort of belief like seep deeper,
Yeah.
Is that kind of what you're saying? Like, because I just felt like it was, the belief part felt totally out of my control. It felt like something that I just didn't feel, but I wanted to. So what do you say to somebody who's in that position of wanting to have that experience that you're describing?
Well, in my case, the key word was not truth, though I think truth is important, but goodness. I wanted to know how to be good. Yeah. And it wasn't a matter of forcing myself to believe anything, but to find those kinds of practices, I guess you'd call them, that made me feel good, made me feel I was the kind of person I wanted to be.
I love that.
That's what I went with.
Love it.
You it's interesting to me that you've lived a life of such deep faith, but you've also reached the heights of the academic world. Could you talk about maybe to what extent it was a struggle to straddle that line between intellectual and believer as you proceeded throughout your career?
Yeah. Well, there is a temptation in the academic world to kind of disguise your Mormonism, not make my thinking. I was not of that frame of mind. I feel very uneasy if I'm sort of two people.
Yeah.
I really want to be one person. And that means I'm a little more academic than lots of Mormons want me to be. On the other hand, among my colleagues, I'm a little bit on the nutty.
It goes both ways.
On the belief side. I'll tell you a story to illustrate it. I got a job at the University of Delaware. And after I'd been hired, the member of the search committee took me out for lunch. And we were driving along, and I was just making conversation. I said I was working on a book on Joseph Smith. I was writing Beginnings of Mormonism. And he stopped, he said, "Richard, we took all that into account and decided it didn't matter." And I think that's the way a lot of my colleagues, he's pretty good as a scholar, but he's got these nutty blades, but what the heck, So when I first got to Columbia, I was being introduced among the faculty. One of the men said, "Oh, yes, you're the Mormon." So there I was. And I find some way in every course I teach to let it be known I'm a Latter-day Saint. And if you do that, then you don't feel so precarious. Yeah. I mean, it's all out in the open. You don't have to take steps to conceal who you are. And some kids, it helps. In every class there are kids who are struggling with their own faith, not Mormon kids, but Catholic kids and others. And they have someone teaching the class who admits they're a believing Mormon, then that leaves a lot of space to believe about your own faith.
Wow.
I felt like that was the approach that you took in Joseph Smith, Rough Stone Rolling as well, sort of very upfront about your beliefs, and even the way that you framed the prose was not, and then Joseph claimed that this happened. You just said, and then this happened, which was disarming, I think, in a lot of ways, to have you sort of show that vulnerability in your belief. But it did not strike me as subjective still. I felt like you were able to walk that line perfectly, to be honest.
Yeah. Well, I think it's very clear. I've just finished this book on the gold plates, and on the first page, I had to say how I feel about the gold plates, because everybody who reads the book will want to know. That's the number one thing
Yeah.
they will want to know.
Well, do you want to just tell us then how you feel about the gold plates?
Yeah. I love the gold plates. They deserve more attention than they get.
Yeah.
Okay.
So before we move, I want to dig into that a little bit more, but can I just ask, in these settings where you're with colleagues who are on par, like it, just very academic and have kind of this scientific mindset, can you just talk about, and I'm imagining you on this quest for goodness, but maybe and maybe that feels more important than truth and like finding a factual truth. Did that give you a little bit more room to be less exclusive? Because I think sometimes we can be very exclusive about the way we feel about our faith, and we have so much goodness to offer, but at some point it seems like that goodness can even become sort of a stumbling block if we really believe that we have it all and we only have something to give and nothing to receive. So did this orientation toward looking for goodness just give you more? Did you feel like that gives you a little bit more room for generosity toward what other people have to offer and what they maybe practice in their own faith traditions?
Well, I think anyone in Salt Lake City or anywhere nowadays meets a lot of people who are very good people.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
They may believe in God, they may not, they may be Baptist, they may be Islam. And so it's very hard to say that God isn't as interested in them as in Latter-day Saints. So I never try to say anything that implies I think I have the superior way. For that reason, I'll tell you frankly, in testimonies, I never say I know the church is true.
Really?
And it's not that there aren't things I know deeply and believe in deeply, but when you say it that way, you're saying everybody else is invalid. Mm-hmm. I have the real belief.
Yeah.
And I'm just telling you to your face, I know what's true, which always implies you're a Catholic. You don't know what's true.
Wow. Yeah.
And I just don't think that's right, because we don't want to invalidate other religions. That's bad.
Yeah.
And do you feel like there are ways of finding goodness in other traditions that are literally just as valid? That like someone could grow up in Judaism or in Catholicism or in Islam, and could they be connecting with some kind of goodness that is just as fruitful in their life?
I think so. I mean, I can't speak for them. And you can talk about, well, if you think Catholics are true, what about the two ideas of God? I don't worry about that.
Yeah.
I can't reconcile that. I know what works for my God and presumably works for you, and I don't want to have a battle of gods.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So without using this phrase, I know the church is true. Like what might you say if we heard you stand up in testimony meeting? What are the phrases that we might hear?
How grateful I am for what the Lord's done for me, and
That's beautiful.
That really works for me.
How do you deal with the scripture in D&C that says the only true and living church? How do you think about that phrase?
Well, that's a hard one. That's the hardest for us to deal with. But I think the truth is we have to find out what it is about our church that's going to be most important to the world. And to find out what is our mission and what is the what part of the truth do we have that we can do that maybe no one else can do. I mean, like temple work, getting all those families good. That may be the most important thing we're doing.
Wow.
Lord.
So with that in mind, then what do you think is the role of studying our own history? How should that affect, or should it affect our faith, our living faith?
I think so. The implication of your question, I think, is, can we just forget our history and just live our good life? I think that would be a mistake, because there's lots of things in our history that enrich and enlarge our faith. I mean, the gold plates, for example, it's probably the most embarrassing part of our story, the gold plates, which you can't see, which are no longer here. It seems like it's crazy to believe in them. But the gold plates represent a part of our belief in magic. And that is that we live in a world where who knows when an angel will come through the door and when they will find marvelous things that are not just something fuzzy up in heaven, but can sit on the table. You can cover them in a cloth, so that it opens up the possibilities of powers beyond ourselves coming to our aid. And I personally think that's great importance. If you figure you've got to live your life and take hold of your bootstraps and lift yourself up, that's a hard lift. But if you say there are powers beyond me, if I can just find the right way, they can flow into my life. And, that's kind of a magical belief. And I think the gold plates make that real. That God and angels can be right here.
You want to live in that enchanted sort of world.
I want an enchanted world. I think it's a good world to live in. And more, scholars are discovering there's a lot of enchantment in science. That no one can live in a totally disenchanted world.
Yes, I think that's totally right. Quantum physics looks a lot like magic.
Absolutely. I mean, it's the most fantastic magic you can ever imagine.
Let me ask you, sorry, were you going to say
go
something? A lot of people, I think, grow up, at least I grew up, with this sort of dominoes type of testimony where if you lose gold plates, then you lose Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon. And if you lose Joseph Smith, then you lose the priesthood and you lose modern day prophets. And sort of everything crumbles, if you lose that initial factual belief in this object that, like you said, is very hard to believe in. Do you believe that that's an appropriate path for a testimony to take, that it does hinge on something like that? Or is there a way to, I'm speaking for the people who just can't, at least for right now, find it within themselves to believe in gold plates. Does that mean they should leave the church?
Well, unfortunately, I think in many cases it means they do.
At least in practical
leave the
terms.
Church.
Yeah.
I mean, they objected Joseph Smith marrying a 14-year-old girl. Pretty soon they don't believe in God or in Jesus Christ, which is not logically sound. That they shouldn't rely on one another. But my own feeling is whatever you can believe, you should hold on to. What I also say is if you give up those things, you lose something. Like I've talked about gold plates. If you give up on gold plates, you lose a sense of the world that's just filled with energy and power and goodness.
Yeah. So what about those problematic parts of our history? I mean, I remember when Rough Stone Rolling came out and just we wept over some of those chapters because I think we had really filled in a lot of the blanks with something that was really sanitized and that was very comfortable, and we just didn't even realize the way we were we were editing our own history until we read that book. And it was really hard coming, knowing it was coming from someone that we felt like was safe, like someone that we trusted, that felt like this wasn't like there was nothing antagonistic about this resource. And that made it even harder to digest. And I think the hardest part were these things like you mentioned, like the marriage to a 14-year-old girl that just feels so distasteful, that for me the natural question was like, should I leave the church? Like, I know I felt comfortable with this idea that we believe in flawed prophets, but I think I had some sort of line where as soon as that was crossed, and I think that the 14-year-old marriage, that felt like a line, and I wondered if it meant that God couldn't work through a prophet that flawed. Like this just felt too uncomfortable, and I really wondered if it was possible for something so good to keep coming through something that felt so bad. So talk about people who are troubled by really problematic pieces in our history.
I think that's a huge problem these days, or it was at least 5 years ago, but one of the greatest. And of course the question is there a degree of unworthiness that means God cannot work through you?
Yeah, that's the question.
That's the question.
Mm-hmm.
And we are not very well prepared to answer that question because we have a sense of the righteous person, the active in the church person, someone who keeps all the standards. And if anyone, starts smoking or has an extramarital affair, they've really slipped. But in other religions, Catholicism, I think strenuously, there's a notion of original sin and grace that allows space for lots of error, and God still, in the midst of all that darkness, his light can still shine. I don't know. Anyone who asks that question should read a book by Graham Greene, Catholic, called The Power and the Glory.
Okay. That
tells the story of a priest who was totally unworthy, but he got into occupied territory, and here were all these Catholics who were kept away from the church by the dictator. And when this priest came, they just came and begged him to please administer the Eucharist. They wanted the divine presence. And this guy who said, I can't do that. And they insisted he did. Pretty soon he started doing it. They were thrilled, and he sort of rose to a higher level when he was, totally unworthy. So that Catholic sense, it's also in Brideshead Revisited at the very end, Evelyn Waugh's book, that shows God working in anybody. Flannery O'Connor is filled with that same thing.
Yeah, it sounds like you think we could benefit from maybe a little bit more of that, Catholic-infused sort of sense of grace. What are maybe some cultural or theological tweaks we might be able to make to embrace that more fully, to the extent you think we should?
The idea of grace?
Yeah, or not grace specifically, but the giving grace to flawed people, including leaders.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a terrible thing to expect perfection of general authorities. I mean, that's a terrible thing to require. You got to be perfect in every way. And I think we're pretty good with bishops at the bishop level. Someone's made bishop, we love him, we trust him, we seal the mantle falling upon him. If he makes a mistake, we don't care.
It's to be expected.
He's just our pal. We know him.
Yeah.
And you can even get mad at him a little bit, but he's still the bishop.
Yeah.
And I think that's very helpful. And it's true for a lot of priesthoods. But then the higher up you go, the more demanding the standards are.
That's true.
That's very
it's almost
true,
like the less personal relationship we have with the leader, the higher standard we hold them to.
Yeah. And the more exalted their rank and all this and that.
So what would you say then? How would you just define the role of a prophet? Because I think that's maybe where it gets a little bit confusing, is that I think we hope that because they have so much responsibility that they somehow have access to more connection to God, So if we can't necessarily expect that, how would you define that role?
Yeah. Well, I think they probably do have a more connection to God because they hold the office. So I think that's very important in our church, that we honor the prophet, because that then sort of validates the whole organization. Then all the priesthood ranks and, of course, all the women's ranks can call upon that aim. So, but that doesn't mean that he'll be flawless, that there never be an administrative error or a wrong word said in conference or something. And we just have to sort of live with that and not get too excited.
Yeah, that leads actually right into a question that I had for you, which is, I know you've served as a patriarch, which is sort of a unique and weird calling in some ways that Aubrey was making this point.
Kind of like mystical.
Yeah, it's maybe the most mystical thing we do. Like, we're very, at least our modern church seems to be very rational most of the time. But with this calling of a patriarch and the idea of patriarchal blessings, we do expect this real, like, immediate connection to God and like a direct channel. Could you talk a little bit about what that experience was like, and did you feel a different type of connection when you were tasked with that responsibility? It's a big deal because people are going to rely on this for the rest of their lives for direction.
Believe me, I think about that a lot. Yeah, it's very demanding in that sense. It isn't quite as different as we think it is. We give blessings all the time. Fathers give blessings to their children. Anyone who's ordained, anyone who's set apart, there's always a little blessing.
Yeah.
And it's not all that distance. It's still finding that place in your mind where you trust you're speaking for the Lord. In my case, it continues to require a lot of effort and concentration. But my problem was editing. I'm a writer. So a thought would come in my mind. I'd think about that in the very process of speaking.
Wow.
And then I'm sort of making a little outline in my head of what I'm going to say next. It doesn't work.
Yeah.
Wow.
There was a general authority came out shortly after I was ordained, who said, the brethren have one message for you, patriarch. Give voice to the spirit of prophecy. And what you really have to do is learn to just yield. Just let the words flow, not worry about it. And you just do much better that way.
Wow. Was that an experience that felt familiar? And I know it's a totally different context, but did you feel like it was a voice or a feeling of relaxing into the spirit that you had come to know already before this calling?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think so. It's not a case apart. It's an extension of what we all in our, you give a blessing of healing. Sometimes, it's just perfunctory. Sometimes you feel like, you're really voicing the power of God. So we're all sort of in and out of it. The problem with being a patriarch is you have to do it all the time.
Yeah.
You have to really work at it.
Can I ask? I think
two questions.
Okay.
Okay, you can go. I'm going to ask you.
Okay, my question is about this particularity of declaring lineage for someone in a patriarchal blessing, because I've felt like I obviously haven't served as a patriarch, but I've blessed people, including my kids and that type of thing, and you do find this place where you, like obviously, I liked her term, where you sort of relax into the spirit, but you trust that even if your words aren't maybe exact, that the message is still working its way through. But with the declaration of someone's lineage, you can't get that word wrong, right? Like it's got to be the one. How did you feel? Was that a particularly nerve-wracking portion? And second question, to what extent did you see that as a literal, like, adoption into the house of Israel, or a part of it?
I've been in a patriarch since 1989.
Wow.
But I still don't really get the tribes business. It doesn't really make a big deal to me. I always open my mind and sort of wait for any word to come, but I don't really sweat it. And my own view is the critical thing is being part of Israel. The tribes, we think they'll have a mission of some kind, but if you look in what Jacob told his kids, those tribes are very crazy missions. There, you read them over and you say, I don't want to make anyone Dan, because But I think Israel is very important.
Yeah.
The construction of a holy family and a holy people, because the responsibility of Israel is to bless the people of the earth. So we have to think of ourselves on a mission to bless the people of the earth, and we need to reinforce that.
We want to definitely spend some time on that, but before we move on from this, one more question about this idea of patriarchal blessings. I'm just curious if you would describe it, if you would differentiate between like revelation that is flowing during a blessing and what you might recognize as intuition when you're not giving a blessing. Like, is that the same voice?
I would like it to be. I would like, whenever I write, I would like very much to have the Spirit of the Lord guiding me. I don't come very close to that, but when I'm writing Redstone Rolling, I'm writing about Joseph Smith and for his people. I knew that Mormons read it, and I felt like I had a real responsibility to really say something that would be useful to them. So I'd pray very hard.
Yeah.
I wouldn't wait for. Then once I prayed, then I just do it. I'm not.
Yeah.
It's not. When I give patriarchal blessings, I'm sort of waiting for the words to come. When I do it, I write history. I just write it.
Just get going.
I'm curious. Actually, I have a question for you. Are you asking that as a woman? Because obviously, when we could talk about this. It could seem very exclusive, right? When we're talking about like the feeling of giving blessings, I don't. It does. There is a little bit. I mean, to my sort of modern millennial sensibilities, a little bit of a cringe factor, because it seems possible that we could be excluding half the population from this really special feeling. And so I like your question. I think it's really important, because it's not, it shouldn't be, right?
Well, I'm not sure women can't give blessings. My wife is known to give blessings. She believes very much in them. But there's a lot of precedent, and it was sort of discouraged for a long time, and women don't do it in the name of the priesthood. But in our daily prayers, when I really want things to work, I ask Claudia to give the prayer. So she's a great prayer.
Thank you.
I think one more thing I would love to ask too is something that that I've worked hard to recognize is whether this is a voice coming from outside or a voice coming from inside. And I think I think I grew up believing that God's voice was something very outside of myself. And so I was always sort of like that orientation itself kind of caused some separation. And so for me, imagining that the inside voice, like the voice that is coming from the deepest part of me, could be the same as God's voice, has been a really connecting experience. I feel like it's really opened up onto something. And so that and that's what I had always called intuition, and I just thought that it was separate. So I guess that's kind of what I mean. Like that feels like what you're connecting to. It's something from inside you that God's reaching.
I think for me, there's sort of two kinds of revelation. One I call intrusion. We're always saying, I wasn't thinking about this at all, and then suddenly the thought came to me, as if that were evidence it was God.
Yeah.
I'm more interested in infusion. I want the Holy Spirit to work through my mind so that it will speak and think truth. And so that I trust, once I've prayed, then I just trust my mind. I just trust it.
That is so interesting, because that's always, I remember, I think it was Elder Bednar who said, the question I get asked more than any other is, how do you recognize the Spirit? Or something very close to that. And it feels like, I think a lot of times we think if we can recognize that it's coming from our own mind, then we're dismissing it because it means it's our mind, not the Spirit. But you're saying you trust that like it's going to filter through your mind.
Yeah.
And so whatever comes next is the Spirit.
You have to work for it. It's hard to get. But when you get in the right groove, then you just have to trust with it. Otherwise, you spend your time thrashing around trying to find the right words.
Oh, I love that.
Could we spend a little bit of time talking about Joseph Smith, Redstone Rolling? I think for me and for a lot of people that sort of occupy this space where you care about a certain set of things within the church, it's almost like there's a before rough stone rolling and after rough stone rolling like era. And Aubrey alluded to this a little bit, but to be honest, like the book played a major part in kicking off what then for me felt like faith crisis and now feels like a real transformation. And I mean that totally 100% as a compliment, because I wouldn't give up this change, this shift that my faith has undergone in the last 10 to 12 years for anything. And I wonder how it's been from your perspective, because I imagine you must sense that a lot of people have felt like I felt, sometimes with different outcomes, sometimes with similar ones. But how has it been for you to observe the effects of this sort of monumental book over the last 17 years?
Well, I've said many times that timing is everything. And the book came along at a moment when people needed this. And it's because of what you described as the people who are interested in faith matters. There's a demographic in the church now. Faithful members, probably pretty well educated, but certainly informed and curious. They want to know. Mm-hmm. And they want it straight. They want something that sounds real, not something that is just the Sunday school version. Yep. And if I had written a book, 40 or 50 years ago, there wouldn't be enough of those people around. Now they're all over. They're in the firesides that Terrell and Fiona Gibbons give, and all over the place. And they're actually a very important group, because these are the people who do a lot of the church work because they're faithful, but they're supple. They're not thrown off. They don't crack or break when they run into something. They're willing to sort of roll with the punches. And they want things they think they can rely on. Yeah. And if you base your writing on what is in the record rather than some image of what Joseph Smith should have been, then you're safe. Then you're on secure ground. But until you get on that ground, you're never safe, because there'll be something will come out of the bushes and surprise you.
We totally learned that. What would you tell someone who maybe has not read the book yet, but who is feeling a call to understand our own history? Like, I wish someone had sat me down before I read the book and said, here's how to look at these characters who I had up till that point really approached as heroes. They felt untouchable. I had like this reverence around them. I felt like there was something wrong about criticizing what they did or who they were. And I think a lot of that made me a little bit brittle, and it made it really hard to hear stories that I hadn't heard. So what would you tell someone who is about to read and they have the best of intentions, they just want to understand? Like, are there helpful paradigms for how to look at our historical characters?
Mm-hmm. Well, your experience, I'm sure, was repeated many times over. We have such a fixed view, all those lovely stories, which are, as we know, 95% true, but they get disrupted, and you hear any diversion from that, and you think, what's going on here? Mm-hmm. And I think there were people who didn't like rough stone rolling because they were trying to protect grandmothers and traditional people. But until we get it out onto this factual basis, we'll never be secure. So you kind of have to sacrifice the grandmothers to the grandsons and daughters, so they can have something they can really rely on. Yeah. But if I think the book is such that if you let it settle in, it seems right after a while, because I'm writing as a believer, and anyone who looks closely at it is going to pick up all the signs. As one person said, you give both sides of the story, but you always give the good side last. And it's true. I'm managing that very carefully.
Yeah. Can I ask you a related question about what you think of the idea of the Spirit as a comforter, meaning that when we're feeling the Spirit, we're feeling comfortable? And I'll tell you why I asked this question. It's because in preparation for this interview, I actually went to excuse me, I went to the Deseret Book website, looked at Rough Stone Rolling and some of those user reviews, and they were mostly 5 stars, but there were some scattered 1-star reviews, which often said something along the lines of, I didn't feel the Spirit when I read this book. Meaning, and I'm sort of rolling my eyes when I'm reading this and saying, well, guess what? That's called discomfort. But then the rebuttal I can imagine from this imaginary, reviewer that I'm having this argument with says, well, the Spirit is the comforter. So if I'm feeling uncomfortable, then I'm not feeling the Spirit, and therefore the Spirit's not here in these words. So what do you have to, how would you weigh in on that?
Well, I have met people like that. The only word I have is patience. Sort of just wait and think about these things. And I do apologize for having, but as I said before, I felt like I just had to put it on a factual basis.
Yeah.
Or it would never be secure.
That's right. I think that's right.
It did feel like security. And I patience is the word that I think I would choose too, because it just hurt. The whole book, it was so hard. And then, but then you start from something real, and it feels like then you can really start healing and figuring out how to have an experience inside the church that feels so deep and not so easily disturbed. I think we really did come to Rough Stone Rolling with a fragile faith, and that's why it was so hard to read. So I felt really grateful for that, but I'm not sure anything could have helped besides time. Like after reading it just seemed like there was some healing that had to be done, and we had to just sit with this idea that it's not what we thought, and eventually that started to feel okay again, and there was something to work from. But it was a really disorienting and like scary experience to let go of what we thought was ours, and it never was. Like what we thought we had wasn't exactly right. And I think the pain sort of mirrors how incorrect it was, like maybe the more we knew, the less painful that would have been. But I think we had so many misconceptions that it was really hard to wrench those free. But it was such a gift to be able to have this solid foundation to really begin engaging with. And that's what that book really was for us. Mm-hmm. But I wonder if there's this notion that came up a lot. And actually it came up a lot when back reading the book, that you should be careful, and that that there's some things that are dangerous to your faith. And I remember
not in the book, you're saying.
No.
Yeah.
The idea of engaging with history, like I remember people telling me to be careful about what I read, and so I wonder if you could just address that specifically. How do you feel about this idea that like you could learn too much, that and it could actually be detrimental in your life?
I just don't think you can say, if I turn over the next stone, there'll be a snake, it'll bite me. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you live in fear of factual matters, you just have to feel secure enough in your own mind, your own spirit, that sooner or later you can manage any problem that comes along that way. Otherwise, you're not on safe ground. Yeah.
When you said if you had released this book 40 or 50 years ago, there wouldn't have been enough interest, like there wouldn't have been people that wanted to read it, enough people that wanted to read it. But I started constructing in my head what that would have looked like generally. What do you think would have happened with you as an author if you had released this same book, Rough Stone Rolling, word for word, 40 or 50 years ago?
You mean, would have they gotten after me?
Well, yes, to give you the context, I just finished Terrell's biography of Eugene England, who I know is your close friend, Stretching the Heavens. And I get the feeling, not having lived through that era, that it would have been quite difficult for someone being that upfront about history.
Well, I can speak for 1984. That's not too far back. That's when I published Joseph Smith and the Beginnings of Mormonism. Yeah. And there were two things in there that were quite irksome. One was that he did participate in treasure seeking, which was thought of as a slur on his character that was mounted by anti-Mormons to discredit the whole family. And I put them right in the middle of treasure seeking. And the other is that I wasn't sure when the Melchizedek priesthood was restored, because everyone had said it was June 1829, right after John the Baptist, and I wasn't sure from the records. And when it came out, a lot of people in the Institute system didn't like the book. It was going to be part of a series by Deseret Book that the Church History Department was, and they not only, when my book came along and was read, they canceled the whole series.
Oh, wow.
What?
So I felt like poor Leonard Arrington, who had dreamed up this idea, had been shot down
Oh my gosh.
by a friendly fire. But within a few years, we had all of the business about a toad appearing, the salamander deals.
Yep.
And the magical element of Joseph Smith's experiences kept coming up. And within a few years, the church was citing this book as the fact that a way of telling the story that it included treasure seeking. And when they sent out 14 books to libraries to say, here's the story of Mormonism, Joseph Smith and Beginnings was one of the 14th. So it suddenly became to their rescue, to the general authorities' rescue.
Wow.
So for me, it was affirmation. I should just tell it like I see it.
Yeah.
If I do anything else,
Yeah.
I'm not going to be of any help to the church.
Is that what you would tell the lay member of the church? Like, is it useful for every member of the church who's not in a position of writing the history? Is it still useful for all of us to be kind of in that process of searching for what actually happened? Or do you think that that's less important for a faith in the now?
What do you mean search?
Like I just feel like there's this sentiment that, like, you can just set it aside and, someone's doing that work, but we don't have to know the nitty gritty of what happened, and that it's causing problems, and just, don't.
I just forget it.
Yeah. Just like focus on Sunday and your.
Yeah. I don't think it's bad advice. I mean, you can live an awfully good life if you're just going on Sundays. It all depends on your mentality. If you've got a little sore spot in your mind and a little infection there, you better face up to it and try to,
Because I think that's often who is those people who have a sore spot. That's a good word for it. I think a lot of times what they're advised to do is they're the ones who should put something on the shelf or, turn away, like, don't look into it more because it's already causing problems. So you're saying, no, that's like, lean into it. If you've got that pain, then that's a call.
You almost have to. Yeah. It is, call.
Yeah.
It's a good way to put it.
Wow.
Yeah. It seems somewhat apparent maybe to me that in these last 40 or 50 years, we have made strides, and I think of them as good in terms of intellectual freedom and just ability of members of the church generally to sort of voice, I don't know if unorthodox is the right word, but just like views that maybe differ from the mainstream. I mean, to some extent, Faith Matters in this podcast are even are expressions of that we're sitting here, week after week having conversations that I think probably would have been much more challenging to have a few decades ago. So I'm curious, do you feel like in the church culture, in terms of that desire to be able to have that type of freedom, have we arrived, or is there still more room to progress?
Well, there are a lot of people who feel uneasy about it, and there are probably general authorities who say, don't bother with it.
Yeah.
But for certain, and a growing body of people, and I refer to this demographic I was mentioning before, of sort of curious people, I think they recognize that we have to be able to explore. And frankly, I think it's rewarding to explore. Point two, we've never been stronger intellectually than we are right now. We have more competent, open-minded, well-trained historians and philosophers and artists, everything under the sun, than ever. I mean, we're just deep and really competent people. So if we want to find out, there's going to be someone around who's looked into the problem and you can get a lot of help.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. We know that you've been doing a lot of work to promote Latter-day Saint art. Could you just talk a little bit about that and how that has become important to you and why you think it should matter to our community?
Well, it's true. I'm up to my neck in Latter-day Saint art now. We started this organization, the Center for Latter-day Saint Arts, in 2017. We've been having festivals, and they're getting bigger and bigger. And now we're planning a giant festival for Utah 2024.
Oh, wow.
Amazing.
Okay.
Yeah. And we're down here today talking to various people. BYU is going to be involved. All the art institutions up and down the state are going to be putting on work by Latter-day Saint creators.
Very cool.
Artists and musicians and so on. Not just performers. We're not doing performers, but creators. People somehow sense that art is next. And that's what happened to me. I suddenly realized art is the next frontier.
Really?
I'd worked on scholarship all my life. And the state of Mormon history is really pretty good. The Mormons really control their own history, which they didn't when I got started. But I think art, we got a lot of artists. We have a very strong tradition. I'll tell one story. Some of you of your listeners will know the name of McKay Coppins, who
absolutely.
Writes for the Atlantic and is a very sharp guy. And he was assigned by his editor to write a response to the Under the Banner of Heaven.
Yes.
And you may have seen his essay in the Atlantic Monthly.
We did, yeah.
And he was bemoaning the fact that Mormons get beat up so much in the Book of Mormon, the musical. They laugh at us, and the Under the Banners of Heaven makes us out as all proto-killers. We're on our way to slaughtering our neighbors. And he asked a friend, why is it that Mormons are so badly treated? And the friend said, it's easy. You don't have any cultural cachet.
Yep.
They think of us as simple, sweet, simple-minded people. We don't have any depth to us. So what we need is more learning and more philosophy and depth of thought, but also more art.
Wow.
So I think we need it for that reason. And he said we don't have cultural cachet. We have a fantastic artistic tradition that begins with Joseph Smith building a temple in Nauvoo when they have nothing. They're about to be driven out. And do they give the endowment in a barn? No. They have to build a temple.
Yeah.
They have to put carved sunstones and moonstones and make a beautiful space. And of course the Salt Lake Temple, 40 years in making, the greatest work of art ever performed by a Mormon hand. It's right at the core of our religion. So I think we're not just a church, we're a people, and we have a culture, and I think the culture is important to us.
Yeah.
So we need to foster it. We need to see our artists as resources who do wonderful things for us, tell our story in a new way.
Can anyone contribute to your organization, and how would they do so?
Well, we have a website, Center for Latter-day Saint Arts.org, all lowercase, all together with no spaces. And there's a story of what we're doing. We're doing lots of things right now, and you get a sense of what they all are, with more to come. And of course, we certainly appreciate anyone who has a nickel that want to contribute to the cause.
Yeah, and is this a nonprofit organization?
It's a nonprofit organization run by Latter-day Saints, and we're independent. We keep our independence, but we think of ourselves as a resource to the church, and we collaborate. Our next big exhibit will be in the Church History Museum.
Oh, wow.
And
cool.
We're planning events that may turn up in the Tabernacle. So the church has been very, very cooperative with this.
That's amazing. Love it.
Yeah, maybe to wrap up, this is a big question, but I think this is an appropriate send-off point. Can we come back to this idea of the gathering of Israel and the house of Israel and the calling of the house of Israel? And what do you imagine is our mission? I think there's a really literal way that we've loved to talk about the gathering of Israel, and I think that that's starting to not feel quite so resonant with a lot of people. But it's something that President Nelson is talking about all the time. And so I would love to just hear how you imagine our role looking in this third century of the church.
And I'll just jump in too and say this ties a little bit into your Wayfair essay about saving the world.
Yeah.
And how could numbers so small actually do
well,
a thing
in
like
my
that?
mind, they're greatly related. For a while, gathering of Israel was very clear. You preached the gospel and brought them all.
Yeah.
First to the cities of the Midwest, the Zion cities, and then to the Great Basin Kingdom and the villages. And then we spread out into the world where we stay, we build temples, we build stakes, we do everything. So we're a global church. And the question is, what happens to the people who don't gather?
Mm-hmm.
When you gathered earlier, come together, you sort of leave them to their own fate, implying that if they don't gather, they may be lost. Now, when we live among them, are we willing to say they're lost, or do we have a responsibility to people who don't join the church, who hear the missionaries and don't join the church? Do we have anything to give to them? And we are not very good on government programs. We don't try to get legislation. The church, if anything, is sort of held back. It's not big for the New Deal. It's not big for any of the programs of the 20th century. So what can we do? And it's a long game, and it seems almost impossible at times. But the real question for us is, can individual people of goodwill exercise enough influence to really make the world a better place? Mm. Not resorting to government, but in your parent-teacher associations, on the basketball floor, in the boardroom. If there are Latter-day Saints there, can they be little foci of goodness and goodwill? And, of course, that's what's meant by being the leaven in the lump. And I think what this leads us to say is this teeny tiny fraction of the world's population, can they do it alone? I don't think so. I think, fortunately, the world is filled with people of goodwill. They're everywhere. We meet them every day. And we need to sort of link arms. We need to sort of give them courage. If we speak out, that gives them the courage to speak out. So that little by little we can form this sort of this mass of individuals doing good things. And I think probably in the long run you're more likely to get good results than top down.
Yeah.
We're a grassroots kind of world saviors.
Wow, thank you so much. I love that image, and it's so empowering to recognize ways that we can just be the light and the salt and the yeast in our exact situation and with our exact talents and wherever we are. So thank you,
Richard.
So much.
This has been really special.
Yeah, we appreciate you. All right, thanks so much for listening. We really hope that you enjoyed this conversation with Richard Bushman. We couldn't be more grateful to Richard for coming on to speak with us. And again, if you'd like to stay up to date with the amazing things that Richard and his team are doing, you can head to centerforlatterdaysaintarts.org. And as always, if Faith Matters content is resonating with you and you get the chance, we would really love for you to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or whatever platform you listen on. We read all of the reviews, and it really does help us to get the word out about Faith Matters, and we appreciate the support. Thanks again for listening, and as always, you can check out more at faithmatters.org.